recorded, but really the meeting content's being recorded. Hopefully you saw a notification that says recording has started.
Yep, it's up there now. Well, great. Well, first of all, thanks to everyone for joining us today for this first webinar of our 2021 webinar series. I'm Paul Charland. I'm one of the co-coordinators for the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative. And I just want to give a quick overview of Prairie Reconstruction Initiative. We are a collaborative effort, as you see, and really the goal for us is to improve your and all of our reconstructions. And we do that basically by learning. We want to learn from the experiences of each other and from the data. Ideally, I hope we can move beyond the cookbook approach. It's not just what to do and how to do it, but as this webinar includes, it's illustrate why the things we need to do work, how the Prairie works. So, and ultimately we want to do that. We'll be successful when we build our community, when we can create multiple forms of engagement, and give people opportunities to engage at different levels and different places in their journey. So again, we're here to work together so that we all improve our reconstructions. So today we have with us Megan Benage from the Minnesota DNR and Karin Jokela from Xerces Society, and we want to say thanks for them for joining us, and take it away.
Thanks, Paul. I feel weird saying thanks for having us because I'm also part of the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative, so it's like thanks for having myself, but it's fine. So a couple housekeeping meeting things. Karin, Jokela, and I are going to be doing this presentation together. So you should be seeing the screen. You should be seeing a PowerPoint. If you're not, just go ahead and type in the chat and one of us will try to help you out. We set up the meeting so that you can unmute yourself freely. So just keep in mind that you have, unlike some webinars, you have full power. So keep in mind that you might want to stay muted the whole time while we're talking. If you have burning questions that come up while we're talking, there's two ways that you can ask those questions. So you can type in the chat and we'll try to get to it at the end as we have time. And then you can also, there's a little hand feature at the top of your screen to the right of the little chat box. And so if you're wondering, well, I don't even see a chat box. At the top of your screen, there's two people. It's basically a circle and then whatever shape that is, like a oblong square. It's two people together and then there's a little message box. So that's how you access the chat. And just to the right of that, there's a little hand icon. And when you click on that, it puts an orange yellow hand next to your name, and then we know that you have a question. And so we would just call on you and you would get to talk to a real live person today. How exciting would that be? So those are your options. We'll try to hold questions till the end because Karin and I have a lot to get through. So just know that. I'm going to go ahead and advance our slide. Or I think I'm going to advance our slide. There we go. There's a little bit of a delay between when I do things and then Teams recognizes I do things. So keep that in mind also. All right, Karin, are you ready?
Sure.
All right, let's go. Okay, so welcome to Designing Seed Mixes with Pollinators in Mind. I love giving this presentation with Karin because she gives a really nice pollinator perspective. I feel like I give a nice ecology and plant perspective, and so it's like a perfect friendship marriage of colleagues. It's a terrible way to describe that. Oh my goodness. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about pollinator conservation. We're going to talk about your restoration target community and goals, site considerations, species selection, seeding rates, how you evaluate your seed mix, and then we'll give you some additional resources. This is a lot to cover in an hour, and it takes a lot of energy and time to figure out how to build a seed mix right, let alone for pollinators. So just don't panic as we're throwing a lot of information at you today. Just try to take it in, ruminate, and know that there's going to be lots of questions. I've been doing this for 20 plus years and I still have questions because Prairie is complicated. So just take that for what it is. All right, we're going to start out by giving you a little bit of an introduction to who Karin and I are. And I should say, Karin reminded me to do this. Most of what I'm going to present today is really with a tallgrass prairie lens because I'm based in Minnesota. I'm here in New Ulm, Minnesota, with the L said twice. It's a very German town, and it's currently negative 17 degrees. So it's very, very cold. And so I'll be talking from this kind of Minnesota, but also tall grass prairie perspective. The same principles that we talk about might apply in the midgrass or the shortgrass prairie, but I just want to let you know that that's kind of the lens. So I'm a regional ecologist with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. There's Old New Ulm right down here. Here's me kneeling in a fen, and here's a beautiful prairie, one of the prairies I get to work in. So I was informed by a fourth grader that ecologists study the economy, and that's false. So if you were thinking that you were coming to this to learn about how to manage your money or your stocks, sorry, that's not what we're going to cover today. So I mostly for my job do a lot of prairie coordination, whether it's restoration, management, protection, all those sorts of things. And I'm trying to put all the pieces together. And as an ecologist, for me, I think humans are definitely part of the puzzle, and we can't look at them separately as separate things because we obviously have an impact on the ecosystem and we're part of it. So we need to consider that when we're thinking about finding balance and diversity and connectivity. Karin, it's all you.
Okay. So I work for the Xerces Society, as Megan was saying. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Xerces Society, we are a nonprofit wildlife conservation organization that works to protect invertebrates and their habitat. This is our 50th year. So congratulations to us, I guess, but also to all the people who support our work. We're a membership-based organization. So thank you to any of you out there who might actually be members of Xerces. We really appreciate you helping us do this work collectively. We take our name from the Xerces blue butterfly up here on the right. That's the first butterfly to go extinct in North America due to human-influenced habitat loss. We're based in Portland, Oregon, but we have staff kind of all over the country. I'm based in southeastern Minnesota, and I work kind of across Minnesota and Wisconsin. Go ahead, Megan. My role with Xerces is as a partner biologist for the NRCS. So my position is mostly funded by a partnership between NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the branch of the USDA that's responsible for helping farmers and landowners with conservation. It's funded by the NRCS General Mills and Xerces. And basically I serve NRCS and their landowners and farmers and really any conservation staff that are working on private lands in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And I assist with habitat evaluations, conservation planning. I do a lot of field days, or I used to in the before times. Hopefully we will more this summer. And then this year especially, I've been doing a lot of refining of technical documents and refining conservation practice guides and writing fact sheets and seed mixes. A lot of evaluation and training on how to do that. So bottom line is, if you are in this area, I can be available to you as a resource. And then I want to start here. This is kind of where I start most of my invertebrate and pollinator conservation talks, just to remind you that we live on a planet that is mostly invertebrates, and it should therefore be a priority. There are over 2 million described species on Earth, and if you break that down, so that's 70% of the described species are invertebrates, and if you kind of hone in even more to just the kingdom Animalia, it's represented by over 95%. 95% of the diversity in that kingdom is represented by invertebrates. And so I like to bring this up just to change our perspective a little bit, because when we think about wildlife conservation, so many people think about those large charismatic animals like lions or even tree frogs or birds, that are all vertebrates. And what we really need to be focusing on if we care about biodiversity on this planet is invertebrates and insects. Well, go ahead, Megan. The motto for the Xerces Society is that we sustain, shoot, now I'm going to mess it up, but that we sustain the little thing, it's the little things that sustain us, right? So truly the fate of the world's insects is inseparable from our own fate. Just as Megan was saying, we are part of the system. So we care about soil health, we care about natural pest control, we care about crop pollination and yields and food for us, and therefore we must consider invertebrate conservation as a priority. These are animals that are recycling nutrients for us above and below ground. They're offering free pest control services for us. They're doing that valuable service of turning plant material into food for other animals, little protein packages. And then, of course, what we're kind of focusing on today is that they're helping plants reproduce. Go ahead, Megan.
All right, now it's me. Now I get to depress you. So I feel like Karin brought you up. Like, thanks for that. Karin brought you up, and now I get to be like, it's real bad out there, folks. It's
Has to be said.
Yeah. So, for anybody who's been paying attention, there's been a lot of news stories recently. And I guess what I can tell you is I'm not sure if it's an apocalypse. I'm not sure if it's the collapse of nature. But to quote Jessica Peterson, we don't know what we don't know. So when it comes to insects in general and their diversity across the globe, we think that we've described about 20% of the total diversity. So what that means is there's 80% that we're guessing that we don't know, and that's going to vary across orders and geography, right? So there's places that would be easy to get to survey, and there's also species that are easier to survey. So for example, bumblebees. Okay, they're giant, they're made for Minnesota, they've got their winter coats on, they're pretty easy to see. That's great. But then compare that to like a tiny little sweat bee, we might never even notice them if we're not on purpose looking. So that's just kind of to set the stage a little bit, that we know that there are issues and we know that there are things happening, and I'm going to describe these graphs a little bit for you. So this first chart, the one on the left here, is basically looking at all of the documented population trends, and what we know is that we're seeing about a 33% decline, and it's variable across orders. It's a real bad day if you're a grasshopper. This does not look like a happy day for grasshoppers. And then for folks who are listening, saying, well, who cares? Grasshoppers bug me. Get it? Pun intended. Karin already covered that. Like, they're food for everything else. Like, they really are the little things that are running the world, right? So we should care about them because our fate is intertwined with their fate. So then the second chart is showing you over the past 40 years, we looked at just declines. So it's somewhat of a biased chart, right? Because it didn't look at species or groups that are doing well. It just looked at declines and said, you know, over the past 40 years of the species that are declining, we're seeing about a 45% decline. And then this is just meant to show you, this line here is how Lepidoptera or our butterflies and moths compare with some of our other invertebrates. So they don't seem to be on as steep a decline, if you will, as some of our other things like maybe beetles or grasshoppers. So why is this happening? We had this last study was looking at what's going on, what are the drivers behind this, what's affecting this change, and they saw, not unsurprisingly really, is that habitat change is a huge driver of this. Pollution was second, biological traits like maybe they have a short flight window, maybe they only reproduce once a year or maybe once every 5 years, and then climate change. I would say that as we continue on our climate change journey, because yes, it's here and it's happening right now. I'm sorry if this is the first time you've heard that, because I feel like I just ruined your day. But I would say that climate change, habitat change, and pollution are all also part of climate change. So it would be difficult, I think, to tease some of those impacts out as we go on. So that's kind of where we're at. That's the sad story. And now we're going to lift you back up and give you the hope and the progress that you need to think about how you can be part of the solution. My mom always says, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. She was saying it to me as like scolding me when I was a child, but I think it's good. It's good life advice for how we want to work now. I always think about being part of the solution. So when we start thinking about how we're designing a prairie restoration, the very first thing you should be thinking about are, what are my site goals? And I'm going to give you an example. I had a fella come to me once and he said, Megan, I am so excited that we have this section of land. I cannot wait. We are going to restore this, and it is going to be the best place in the world for pollinators. It's going to be amazing. And I was like, wow, this sounds really nice. Like, so what's your budget? And he was like, $200 an acre. For those of you who are listening, I know you're on mute. You're probably already doing the math and you're thinking, I don't think that's going to be what he thinks it is. Like $200 is probably not going to get you the best pollinator place ever, right? So we do have to kind of reconcile what our vision and our goals are with the practicality of what our budget is. In that case, it was a great conversation we were able to have, because I was able to say to him, I don't think your vision matches your pocketbook. And we were able to find more money and get more diversity out on that site and try to build in more into our seed mix that would attract some of these pollinators that he was talking about. So it was great starting with that, because it allowed us to have that conversation. So you always want to be thinking about that. You also obviously practically have to think about your timeline. There's a cat behind me. I don't just suddenly have a tail, just in case you're wondering. So we have to think about that, and then we also have to think about our field characteristics. Every decision that has been made on that piece of land, every single decision is going to impact its future state. And so I know that can be kind of overwhelming, but you're going to have to think about this. We often treat prairie seeds, because they're native, as if they are magical beings. So we throw them out on a site and we're like, you're native, you're going to make it all happen. And that's not what we see. We have to make sure that we're the same concerns that we would have if we were growing soybeans or corn or hay or whatever it is. We should have those concerns with our prairie. What is my soil structure like? What is my topography like? What are the current issues out there with my vegetation? Do I have weeds? Do I have Canada thistle? Why do I have those things out here? What's happening with my carbon nitrogen cycle? We got to think through all of this. And one of the big ones that I think is coming up more and more and more is this herbicide history and use piece. Nowadays, there's not a site that I do in partnership with managers that we don't ask for a full chemical history if that site has had farming on it before. Because what we are seeing is that the cocktails of chemicals that we are putting out there definitely have restrictions in terms of when you can put different agronomic crops in the rotation, and those restrictions are extending to some of our prairie plants. So we're seeing impacts where we don't have forbs growing, or we don't have anything that grows in the worst case scenario. And so you definitely want to be thinking about, what's my chemical history like? Do I need to wait before I plant this site? Because prairie seed is expensive and I don't want to waste it. I want to make sure that I time this just right. I actually had a farmer tell me yesterday he's not a fan of growing soybeans because of the amount of herbicide he has to use to grow beans. And I couldn't help but think while he's talking to me, I was like, well, what has soybeans done? You know, edamame, why you make us so frowny? Like, that's what I was trying to think to myself. And then I was like, well, what he's telling me is that he doesn't want to use all these chemicals to grow this. And then he's seeing restrictions because he also has cattle in his operation and forage where he can't rotate it out into something as fast as he wants to. Flexstar is a big one. So this is something that we're going to need to be thinking about more and more. Also, there's going to be differences across your site, edge effect, microhabitats. We need to think about all of that. And so then, last but not least, we're going to have to reconcile our budget with our goals, just like I talked about earlier. The reality is, in that example, if we didn't have the money to do that project and make it this best pollinator area ever, maybe we'd have to do it in stages or pieces. Maybe one part of it would be the pollinator mecca and the other part would be something different. You know, somebody told me that the P in prairie stands for patience, and it really does. It takes time to build this stuff right and good. Okay, so diversity. Why does it even matter? Diversity is the #1 indicator of health in any system. And so what I'm talking about with diversity is it's both the number of species and then the size of those populations of those species. So we want to be thinking about how many different kinds of plants do I have out there? And then again, how much of each individual one do I have out there? There's another piece of that that's the spatial component of how is stuff arranged so that all of what I'm building actually works for the little insects that I'm building it for? How far are those insects moving? Do I have enough patches of purple prairie clover next to other patches of purple prairie clover where the insects can actually move and use those floral resources? You kind of have to think about all of these prairie sites using your prairie chicken eyeball, your Dakota skipper eyeball, and then your bison eyeball. Like, how are you building it so that you have all of these structural differences? We call it heterogeneity or diversity across the site so that you're benefiting lots of different things. So I'm going to read you this quote just to kind of put a little pin on this. So a healthy functioning prairie, just like an old growth forest, consists of thousands of different organisms, plants, animals, invertebrates, bacteria, and soil fungi, or fungi, depending on who you are. All those organisms rely on complex interactions of nutrients, moisture, and energy flow, and they need all of that to create and provide them with food, water, and shelter, the things that they need to survive. Unlike forests, the abundance of individual prairie plant and animal species changes frequently in response to disturbance, such as fire, grazing, and climate extremes. What we're left with is a patch of prairie that can look very different from year to year, and the whole landscape is this shifting mosaic of change, which I just love thinking about our prairies like that. So you need diversity so that they can basically be resilient to whatever is going to be thrown at them. Here in Minnesota, we're seeing more frequent 6-inch rains, and so our prairies are going to have to combat with that. Our southern prairies are becoming wetter faster. Our northern prairies are also becoming wetter, but the incremental change is slower. And then we're seeing that our evenings on summer prairies are cooling off faster in southern Minnesota, and we're seeing that more incrementally in northern Minnesota. That's going to have impacts, and we're going to have to figure out how to deal with all of this as managers. And what I would say to you, the hopeful message is diversity. You want to put enough things in there that your planting is resilient, that it is healthy, that it can withstand everything that's going to be thrown at it, whether it's invasive species pressure, soil conditions, or these things like extreme weather events, climate, rainfall, and drought. All right. Deep breath. So now what do? We've told you all the things you need to consider. Really get to know your site. I cannot tell you how many times people say to me, well, I put together a 30 species mix and I just use one mix for my whole site. And I say, well, how big's your site? 100 acres. Yeah, it'll be fine. The seeds are just going to self-sort. Okay, let me say it very clearly. Self-sorting works if your seed mix has hundreds of species in it. If you have a 30 species seed mix and you have a site that has wet areas, dry areas, and something in between, mesic areas, that means in a best case scenario, I've got 10 plants that are in my wet site or 10 plants that are in my dry site if everything sorts evenly, or some combination of that. So you're really telling me that 10 things can do the work of an entire prairie system that had somewhere between 400 to 600 species. That's bananas. It's not gonna work. Even if those plants do self-sort, again, we're treating them like they're magical beans. We need to do a much better job of analyzing our site, figuring out what our drainage classes are, and then drawing planting zones around that. And I know what all you were thinking. You're like, she is trying to make my life hard. That is what she is trying to do. And I'm not appreciative of that. But you have one shot for most of how we do this. For most of us land managers, we have one funding cycle that we get to plant a prairie. You want to put the energy and time into doing it right. And so this map is from Bill Shuna. He and Amber Knudsen make the best maps in the DNR. Sorry, Kent, it's true. And so what he's done is he's basically analyzed this section of land that they're going to restore, and he's grouped his drainage classes together into all of these kind of palish tan ones are well drained. Then he's got excessively drained in the yellow, and then poorly drained is this blue color here, and then very poorly drained, and then open water is the darkest blue. So he's going to plant different seed mixes here. There could be microsites across all of these, and that's why you need to go walk the sites or take a four-wheeler out. You need to become intimately familiar with the land that you're restoring so that you can do a good job. And thanks to GPS technology and some things we can borrow from the farming community, like, oh gosh, what is it called, Karin?
Are you talking about web soil survey?
Precision planting, auto steer. Gosh, I couldn't think of the word. I was like, the GPS you put on your tractor. Because of that, we're able to do some of these things a little bit easier than we might have been able to do them before. And like in this case, they were able to plant these dry, sandy knobs with a totally different seed mix so they can build in some of that structural heterogeneity. They did a really nice job thinking through that. All right, I'm gonna be quiet and let Karin talk.
Okay, so you've intimately become familiar with your site, like Megan was saying. Now you get to do probably the part that most of us prefer to do, which is actually selecting species for the mix. And now that you know all your soil moisture conditions, you want to select species that match those soil moisture conditions, so you're not, for one, wasting money on places, you're not throwing down seeds that are never going to work in certain soil conditions, and so that you're just successful generally, right? I like to just include a little table here because different resources use different kind of terminology for soil drainage, soil moisture. It's just a nice little reference because nurseries and seed companies often use different kinds of language than what you might get from a web soil survey or your GIS layers and that kind of thing. So this is really important. Start here, soil moisture. Go ahead, Megan. And then when you think about building a reconstruction, usually we're trying to mimic nature, right? As best as we know how, and we fall short. But what we can do is try to put in as much functional diversity in the planting as possible, just like the remnant sites that we're often trying to mimic. And yes, prairie plantings do need all these different kinds of functional groups or guilds, some people call them. Within the grasses and sedges, we need cool season grasses, warm season grasses, and sedges and rushes. Yes, even in upland sites, they need sedges and rushes. When we're planting forbs, we want to have a balance of different kinds of forb life histories. So legumes that are annual and long-lived perennial species. I often see mixes that are dominated by non-legume forbs that are annuals or biennials. And that will be very gratifying in the first couple of years, but it will not stand the test of time. It will not have that longevity and have that resilience. So we need to include species that are long-lived perennials and short-lived perennials, some woody species, ideally some hemiparasitic species, some spring ephemerals. All of these should really be included in your initial seed mix because that will reduce invasibility. It will accelerate that establishment and in general, just make it resilient and have that longevity that we need. And because this is a seed mixes with pollinators in mind kind of talk, I have to say that we need flowers blooming from early spring all the way to the late fall. There are some, like bumblebee species that will come out as early as, I don't know, early April, and they need resources right away to fatten up and start their colonies. And then they need resource at the very end of the fall to fatten up and overwinter. Whereas other species are only coming out and flying for maybe a couple weeks at a time, and they're really specializing on one taxa of flowers, if it's a genus or a plant family. So they have sort of short flight periods, but we need an abundance of flowers throughout the season. And really consider evenness of those. We need decent population sizes of flowers. So I often see mixes that are really pretty light on flowers in the spring, and often that's a factor of cost that we'll talk about later. But I really implore you to try to get some evenness in your blooms across the season. Go ahead. And then from from a restoration and reconstruction perspective, we want to choose different plant families, but we also want to do this for the pollinators that we're hoping to attract. Like I was saying with the bumblebees, there are these generalist species that will forage on different plant families throughout the growing season. And then there are specialist bees that really only come out for a short flight period, and they're oligolectic, or what we call kind of picky eater bees. They're going after one particular kind of flower, particular plant group, then specializing and bringing that pollen back to their nests. So to service the greatest diversity of pollinators, we really need to bring as many different plant families into the mix as possible. I highlighted here the asters, legumes, and willows. Those are, well, at least the asters and legumes are really easy ones to get into the mix. And in fact, they host a lot of specialist bees. But I also included willows. There are some prairie adapted willows it's a really important resource for early spring foragers. And there are a lot of specialists on willows as well. And then I also highlighted this native loosestrife genus, Lysimachia. And I highlight it because I don't often see it in restoration mixes very well, but it is fairly common in natural areas. And it's a host plant for a really kind of becoming rare native bee, the Macropus. And these bees collect floral oils from this plant family, or from this genus. And so without bringing those species into our reconstructions, we're never inviting that diversity of bees to the planting. And there's so many different kinds of plant families that may not host a large richness of pollinators, but bringing them in could add 11 more native bee species, or 15 more Lepidoptera species that use that kind of plant family as a host plant. So it's not just monarchs that have host plants, it's also a lot of other moths and butterfly species that need different plant families. And so again, selecting species, how do we even choose the species that we need? Get to know some of your local resources. And this is really Minnesota centric. Some of the species or the resources highlighted here, Minnesota wildflowers, for example. But if you are wondering what resources are available in your state, definitely reach out to your local native plant society and they can guide you to the best resources available. Find one that can give you good natural history information, soils, height, identification tips, and range maps. That's really key. So Minnesota Wildflowers is one that does think something like that. BONAP, Biota of North America, offers really great range maps as well. I highlight Prairie Moon Nursery here, not as an endorsement of that business, but really because of the public library they keep on their website, where you can scroll through and learn about germination techniques and kind of availability and of like hundreds, 700, 800 different species on there. And they also have range maps on their site. And so what's important here is to get to know those range maps, because when you're designing a mix for your site, you may design what you think is the perfect mix, and then you send it out for bid, and you eventually come back with all these potential substitutions because companies may not have something on hand. So you need to use these resources to decide what is an appropriate substitution. Would this different kind of spiderwort actually make sense for my planting site? So that's kind of some of the tools. Definitely get to know these. Go ahead, Megan. And then I wanted to highlight, come on, let's go, waiting, this national tool, because I know some of you aren't based in Minnesota, and it's such a good tool that I don't think people know enough about. It's this Federal Highway Administration's Eco-Regional Revegetation Application Tool, such a mouthful. I just call it the ERA tool. And basically, it's this nationwide database that's searchable of different plants that occur in your ecoregion. And actually, in the last year, they've gone down to state and county. So you can filter plants that naturally occur in your county or your ecoregion by, there might be 40 or 50 different attributes. So soils, showiness, is it commercially available, all these different pollinator traits. And then they've filtered out what they call like workhorse species. So let's just go through a couple of slides of how this works, just to introduce you to this. Go ahead. So I know this is really small for you to read, but I encourage you to go and explore it after the webinar here. So I've selected this like Western Corn Belt region in the map that's kind of grayed out in the back, right? And once I've selected that, it'll pull up this list, and you can either browse them, all the different species that occur in that region, on the browser, which I think tends to be a little clunky because this is like hundreds of 1,000 different plants. What I prefer to do is actually download an Excel spreadsheet of all the plants. Go ahead, Megan. And then again, I know this is really small, but I just want to emphasize that there's so many different attributes that they offer for every single plant species. And these are, you can filter plants by different dry soils or various like soil attributes. And then there's things like, does it attract monarchs? Does it attract honeybees? Does it attract beetles? Does it attract bumblebees? You can create these lists that are like hummingbird specific seed mixes. And so this is just a really, really cool tool that has tons of data in it, and it's really pollinator centric kind of information. So go explore that for sure. It's an underutilized tool, and it's so powerful.
Excellent. I'm trying to anticipate when you're ready for the slides to go and account for the delay. There's clearly a delay. So sometimes I've clicked it before you've told me to, but it just doesn't. Anyway, technology, it's fine. We're doing great. So, okay, transitioning a little bit, and definitely play around with that tool. I think it's really fun to zoom into your house when you use that tool, and you can kind of get some really good ideas. Pollinator lawns for everyone. So speaking of that, our friend Ian Lane over at the University of Minnesota, he's finishing up his PhD work now. And some of what he was looking at is he was looking at restorations and how bees are using those restorations. And so there's some good news, bad news here. So his research really builds on Harmon, Threat, and Hendricks, which put out a paper in 2015, where they basically did a very similar thing, except they did it for 20 years. Looking at reconstructions. What they found is that through time, diversity goes down. That's the bad news story. And we know that. And so we're going to have to figure out how we account for that. And so building diversity into your seed mix at the beginning becomes a very, very important thing for you to do if you know that it's going to decline through time, right? Because you want your resilience to continue through time. So those things need to be happening at the same time. These are I feel like Vanna White with some weird hand gestures, but you're welcome. So what they found when they looked at those reconstructions, the good news is they found a lot of bees seem to be visiting 4 plants in particular. So Harmon and Threat found that golden Alexanders, purple prairie clover, gray-headed coneflower, and then lead plant, which I popped in over on the side here, were plants that had a lot of bees. I'm going to use a non-sciencey word. It's called enormitude. They had an enormitude of bees visiting them, far more than any other flowers. So what they concluded was that at a minimum, we need to make sure that those plants, when appropriate for the site, are included in our reconstructions. The second thing that Ian found is that in addition to those 4, and he actually didn't find lead plant, but the reason why is because he didn't see a lot of lead plant in the reconstructions that he was evaluating. So his study basically looked at about, I think it was 16 sites. And he found, Ian will have to fact check me in the chat if I just said that wrong, but he found that those same 3 species, golden Alexanders, purple prairie clover, and gray-headed coneflower, also had an enormitude of bees. So he basically, same deal there. But in addition to those, yarrow, false sunflower, black-eyed Susan, anise hyssop, man, words are hard, wild bergamot, and stiff goldenrod were also really important. So I say this to you not as a like, only put these things in your seed mix, but as a note to make sure that these things are in your seed mix in addition to the other species that you're going to put in there. And remember, try for as much diversity as you can. I understand the limitations. If you've only got $200 an acre to work with, you're probably not building a 600 species seed mix unless you're doing a lot of hand harvest, right? But doing the work and getting that diversity in there for pollinators and for everything that depends on them is critically important. See, now I'm advancing my own slide and it's not advancing. So in addition to that, Karin mentioned this. She hit on it already. We see this gap with early blooming plants that we're missing. And some of that is the way that we've done restoration over the years, right? If we're doing combine harvest, when are we doing that harvest? Typically sometime in August or late summer. And so we're missing all the species that have already dropped seeds much earlier in the season. Plus, some of these have small seeds and they're just hard to get to. They're hard to do large scale harvests of, but critically important to have them in your mix. I cannot tell you how many times somebody has come to me and they've said, I've got a real Canada thistle problem, a real problem, and I'm going to need to nuke it all. Okay. After you do that, then what? And they go, well, then I'm going to spray it again if it comes back. Okay, then what? Well, then I'm going to spray it again. Doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. If your plan is to spray Canada thistle over and over and over and over and over again, that wildlife management area or TNC preserve or whatever it is not living up to its name. Because you cannot dump a bunch of chemicals into the environment over and over and over and over again and think that it's not going to have a negative outcome. You have to figure out how to put something positive back into the system. And what we're seeing in some of the latest research is that having that early guild filled, having that early niche filled helps you fight Canada thistle. It helps you fix some of those functional problems. We need to start asking ourselves, why is the Canada thistle there? It's a symptom of something that is wrong. And quite honestly, it's an excellent floral resource. So I'll just leave you with that little nugget of bad ecology or good ecology, depending on who you are. So early species are critically important. In this landscape in Minnesota, I'm in a highly agricultural dominated landscape, and it's brown. It is incredibly brown when it hits April. And so our insects, if they're emerging at that time, they are starving. And so we've got to do more to make sure that there's something blooming for them. And Karin mentioned willows. There's some shrubs and other things that I think historically, when we have our prairie lens on, we're like, no trees, no shrubs. But those are really important pieces. If you're thinking about trying to build the landscape back, it's just about considering how do you find balance when you know that you're, in the case of the tallgrass prairie, dealing with less than 2% of it. So how do you build in everything that landscape needs when you already know you're missing 98%? These are not things we're going to solve just today. It's hard stuff. So Tallgrass Restoration Center has this really great seed mix guide, and I'll just pop this up here. We won't go through it in too much detail because I want to make sure we have a little bit of time for questions at the end. But suffice to say, I like this guide because it gives you some good target minimums to use when you're building your seed mix. So if I'm building a dry mix, I want to try to have 55 plants, 55. And I want them to fit these different guilds that Karin already talked about. And then here's seeding rates for that. I can tell you, we plant stuff that's underneath these seeding rates and we don't always hit these minimums, but these are good targets to strive for. They're minimums for success. Think about it like that. A couple other things to consider. Definitely, if you're not building your seed mix with seeds per square foot, please make that change now. Because just like in this example, we've got 5 pounds of black-eyed Susan and 5 pounds of partridge pea. Well, if I take a look at it, I've got 43,200 seeds per pound with my partridge pea. I've got 1,472,000 seeds per pound with black-eyed Susan. A pound does not equal a pound when it comes to seeds. It just doesn't. And so we both have to think about how many seeds I'm going to get and actually put out there, and how that species biologically is going to respond in the prairie. Black-eyed Susans are pretty aggressive, but they also drop out of the planting through time because they're an early disturbance colonizer. They're a pioneer species. So we don't want to put so many of them in there that they overwhelm all of our other plants. And we also want to make sure we get enough in there that we have something blooming early. So it's a balance kind of game. So you can certainly still think in weight. I think in weight still, but if you are just starting out, I encourage you to start out by thinking about how many seeds per square foot you want for each species. That's a really important thing to do. And then this is just we put this formula up here, not because we want you to memorize it, but because we want you to have it after the presentation so that you know how to calculate seeds per square foot. You're obviously also going to still have to calculate it by weight because every place that you're going to get seed is weighing that seed out, but you just need both metrics. Okay, this brings us to our sea turtle species. Anybody ever seen that image of all the sea turtles hatching? It's magical. They got their little tiny flippers out. They're all going towards the sea. It's wonderful. And then all of a sudden, seagull! Sea turtles make a lot of babies because a lot of babies get eaten. And so when you are thinking about designing your seed mix, you need to think about the biology of those species. We have restoration conservative species and we have restoration aggressive species. Restoration conservative species have sometimes ecological issues with showing up in a planting, or we're just not planting enough of them to get them to show up in our planting. So we need to be thinking about, should I add these as a plug? Should I sculpture a hillside, somebody said in the chat, and add 4,000 plugs to it, Chad August, so that I can build in some of that structural heterogeneity and actually have control over it? My answer is yes. Yes, you should be thinking about ways that you can do this because it's too important not to have these species to try to solve some of the issues with why they're not showing up. Also, caveat, just because something makes a lot of seeds doesn't necessarily mean it's a sea turtle plant. Sometimes things like black-eyed Susan make a lot of seeds because they're a short-lived perennial. And so they make a lot of seeds and a lot of seeds grow. So you kind of have to use these principles with a little bit of a grain of salt. So restoration competitive species, things like big blue stem, Indian grass, cup plant, these are all important things to have in a restoration, but they're also all things that can completely overwhelm everything else. I cannot tell you how many sites I have seen that are walls of big blue stem, just solid walls of it. That's not good for me walking through it, and it's not good for a pheasant chick walking through it, and it's certainly not good for a bee if you can't even see any of those floral resources. So I've started leaving some of these plants out of my mixes if I have them on the landscape, and in other cases, they're severely limited because they're still going to show up and be the dominant thing because that's what they do. They're good at growing and they're good at spreading. So these are some minimums for success. This is basically another way of looking at that tallgrass prairie restoration chart. So across all of those seed mixes, whether it was dry or wet, 40 seeds per square foot was a minimum that they had identified for success. We try to shoot for at least 40% with perennial forbs, trying to get more of that balance. But I want to say, it's not just important to have diversity in your wildflowers, it's also important to have diversity in your grasses and sedges. That means that you need to have cool season grasses, you need to have warm season grasses, and yes, just like Karin said, upland sedges apply. There's also wetland sedges. You need to make sure there's that diversity across the board. In a remnant prairie, it's not just big blue stem. We've got muley grass, we have panic grasses, we have all kinds of stuff that we don't even put into our reconstructions. Don't get me started. So then again, limit dominant species, fulfill the guilds, fulfill the guilds, fulfill the guilds. You need those functional groups in there so that you can combat things like invasion, like climate extremes. And then Karin already mentioned this, species from different families, and just as kind of a reference point, a minimum of 20 wildflower species. These are minimums, and we know that if you do this, it will grow and it will work. And so we're always trying to build and get better off of these. If it was my ultimate minimum, I would say a minimum of 100 species total, but that's not practical for every site and every situation, at least not right now. But that's the goal, as much diversity as you can get in there. Karin, this is all you. You're muted.
I'm not muted. Okay, so For those of you who may not actually be in the position where you're designing mixes from scratch, you can still use all of these principles even when you're just evaluating seed mixes. You may get landowners who are giving you potential seed mixes that they want to put on their land, and you have to kind of evaluate and walk them through it. So this is an example of one that came across my desk, and somebody asked me to help walk them through it. So it didn't give me a lot of information, right? There's the species, there's the percent of the mix, seeds per square foot, and the pounds. And now I have to decipher, what does that percent of the mix even mean? They don't say exactly how they're calculating that. So I had to do a little math, and I figured out, okay, 50% of the mix, just adding up those numbers, is the grasses. 50% is the forbs, right? But then if you do the math on the seeds per square foot column, then you're looking at really different percentages, right? You're looking at more like 25% grasses and 75% forbs. And in the world that I work with NRCS, you have to meet certain standards for things. So that's a really big difference and can make or break whether or not this mix meets standards. And then I like to ask myself all these questions here on the right, like how many species are there? What is that forb to grass ratio? You may have to do some of that math, right? What's the total number of seeds per square foot? Are there different species blooming in the different seasons? And what's the abundance of those seeding rates of each species blooming in each season? If your goal is monarch habitat or other kind of hosting different kinds of butterflies, that's an important consideration. Are there host plants available? What is the number of annuals and biennials in the mix, and not only the number of species, but also the abundance. So in this mix, I know it's pretty small. It's hard for you to really piece apart all the details right now, but in this mix, 40% of the forbs by seeds per square foot are annuals and biennials. So once those annuals and biennials kind of fade out, what's going to be left? Is there going to be enough diversity and abundance of other longer lived species? Are those species appropriate on your site? Some of these canned mixes that you'll see may include species that are really out of range for your site. It keeps jumping up and down, so I'm missing all my notes here, Megan, sorry. But check to make sure the species are appropriate, have appropriate soil types. So sometimes I'll see species that are really adapted for wet sites and species that are really adapted for dry sites, and they're in the same mix. And if, like Megan said, if there's hundreds of species, that might be a good strategy for self-sorting. But if it's a mix like this, I would say some of those species are never going to show up. So, and eventually, you have to look at the cost and then reconcile if it's meeting your goals. Megan, do you want to do one more? It's not really supposed to be animated that way. Do you know what I mean? Perfect. Okay, so I like to talk a little bit about the economics of diversity for your own sake, but also so that you can kind of internalize some of these talking points for landowners that you're working with. As you add diversity, in general, you will see a higher upfront cost of mixes, right? So you could see a really low diversity mix on the left there. Maybe it's like dominated by one or two species, in this case, Monarda. It's showing a lot of floral cover, right? So at a certain point of the year, there's going to be a lot of floral resources there, and you're going to be able to do that for really cheap. But in other parts of the year, it's not going to be, it's going to be a flyover zone for pollinators. It's not going to be providing any resources. And you leave it kind of vulnerable to invasion, and it's not going to be very resilient. As you add diversity, like maybe milkweeds or more costly species, you will add a little bit of upfront cost. And ideally, if you can add really high diversity, you do have a little bit more upfront cost. Like in this picture on the right, it's maybe 1 or 2 square feet, but in that small little frame, you've got at least 7 different plant families that I can see in that little spot. And it's not quite as showy as maybe that Monarda planting, but it will stand the test of time, and it may result in reduced management costs down the road. So fronting that cost in the beginning really matters, because what you start with when you plant will determine the results for years to come. So I know we've said that in different words throughout the presentation, but cost is kind of something to consider for the short term and the long term. Go ahead, Megan. And again, I kind of put some of this language in here because I think it's helpful for people who are working with landowners who are not familiar with prairie reconstructions. Because I'll sometimes hear, when I work in an NRCS office, I'll sometimes hear landowners come in or farmers come in kind of like, wow, somebody's making a buck off of this, making a fortune off of these native prairie species. And there's a lot of reasons why species are expensive or not expensive. And it's not just that, these native seed vendors are totally trying to capitalize on this forward momentum of restoration. The factors that can cause species to be inexpensive is that, like Megan was saying, with the black-eyed Susan, have a really short life cycle. You can produce a crop, get it out the door really fast, and keep going with that. It's easy to germinate. They're common species. You can use mechanical equipment to harvest that stuff. The seed is hard. It's not shattering. It's really easy to produce, almost like any other agronomic crop, right? But there are a lot of species that are desirable for plantings that are either rare or you have to hand harvest them out on your hands and knees. They tend to be spring blooming. So spring blooming species tend to have these other factors going on, like they have more difficult germination requirements, irregular shaped seeds. And then just generally, seed pests are a really strange thing for native plants because these are not agronomic crops like some of our other food crops. The seed pests they're native pollinators. Like, for example, monarchs can be a real problematic species in milkweed production fields. So it's a tricky thing to tackle from the production standpoint. So I like to kind of put this stuff out there because you can internalize that and then use that language to describe and help landowners understand why that's happening. We do want to leave some amount of time for questions. I don't know if we'll have that, but I'll rush through this quick. Check out some of the resources on the Xerces website. We have all these really technical guides on prairie restoration management, insect conservation. They're all available for free as downloadable PDFs, apart from a few of those books on the bottom right. Some of those are required. You have to purchase those from a publisher. But we have so many resources on the website. And definitely check out Megan's Prairie Pod podcast. It's amazing. There's many different seasons and it brings in so many different speakers that have a variety of experience on prairie reconstruction. You should say something more about that, Megan.
Well, thanks, Karin. I feel like that was really nice. I've never had somebody else describe the podcast, so that was a really nice commercial. Thank you. No, it's like we just threw a lot at you in about 48 minutes. And so Karin and I teach this as a whole day class, actually a 2-day class. So keep in mind, like, we didn't even cover site preparation. We didn't even cover things like if the site's had a history of tillage, how are you going to recolonize your microbial environment, all of these things. And so the Prairie Pod is really about trying to discuss all of these issues and figure it out with lots of different experts. I think the P in Prairie actually stands for partnerships. And if we're going to build this landscape back, we're going to have to do it together because not a single one of us has all of the ideas for how to do it. Like, we're going to have to put our collective heads together to really do this right and well. And so that's really what the Prairie Pod's all about. It's also about fun, PHUN. It's ridiculous. It's informative, and definitely check it out. There's lots of folks on there who are sharing their prairie passion and their knowledge so that we can get better at this. So we are at the end and we're ready for some questions. I know we're also right at the end of the webinar time. So Karin and I will both type our contact information into the chat. So if you have to run, we totally understand that. You can email us afterwards, but if you have time to hang out with us here and ask a few questions, we'll hang out here also. We're ready to answer them. Oh, Karin, you're so fast. I need to. There, I did it. Oh, there's a hand. Okay, now I got to figure out how to do this. I can see somebody has their hand raised, but I don't know how to do it.
It's me, Mike Mulling from the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Go for it, Mike.
Hey, great presentation, folks. Appreciate it. Discussion obviously is around designing seed mixes, and we do everything is sculpture seeded. Um, One question I did have for you guys, and of course the importance of sculpture seed is to save costs, save money. One thing I wanted to ask you guys is this concept we've been working on called pollinator nodes. Um, and if I can, I share my screen with you for just a second to get your impression of what we're trying to do here. So I'm going to try to request control and just show you a picture.
Oh, I'm still sharing my screen. Yeah, you should be able to just go ahead and do it.
Yep. So I think what you folks are seeing right now is you'll see a map on here. Let me know if that popped up, please.
It did. We can see it.
Okay. So one thing that we've been working on for quite some time here at Min Valley Refuge and Wetland Management District in southern Minnesota, around the Twin Cities area, is we've been working on this what we call a node concept. And so rather than take this 160 acres that you see in here and putting diversity throughout the entire 160, we're taking nodes that are anywhere from, say, a tenth of an acre to 3.5 acres, and diversifying those areas with between 40 and 70 seeds per square foot, and also species in those particular pollinator nodes or pollinator gardens. So my question to you is just like we have the flexibility in this property to do this. Of course, the rest is planted grass and forbs, but not as highly diverse as these pollinator nodes. So my question to you folks is, what are your thoughts overall about this concept for doing some reconstruction?
So Karin and I might have different thoughts about this. So this will be interesting. This will be a good discussion. I think it's a good way when cost is a limiting factor to try to beef up some of your diversity on site. I think some of my concerns with it are quite honestly that if it's for insects, we don't know how far some of them actually can disperse. And we know for some of them, they can only disperse a very small distance. And I wasn't sure on the map, how close each node is to each other. And so how things are spatially distributed matters when it comes to the insects that we're trying to conserve. And I think we don't know enough about how to do that or how to place things. Ian was telling me, we've been chatting about this stuff a lot. He was telling me that it's really important to have things clustered together so that certain species don't have to go as far to get those floral resources. I think it's a good concept. I also then have some general concerns about, like, are we doing enough to make sure that that base level of diversity on the site, that there's enough connectivity where things can move around to get what they need, particularly for things that can't move very far. Those are just my initial thoughts.
That was kind of our rationale for spacing them out randomly in the different sizes too. And of course, this is only 160 acres, so this is less than a quarter section. Right. And we know that dispersal rates are typically less than 0.6 miles for many of our species. So, it's just a concept that we had worked on. We had worked on that with other biologists too. And I think it gives us an opportunity to manage some of these gardens, if you will, in the larger prairie independent of each other without managing the entire tract for pollinators. For instance, we could mow or burn one side off or hay one side off without doing it on the next site. So it gives us some refugia also to think about. And it's really, I think it's a good way. We typically look at native remnants too in similar fashion. When you talk about soils aspects, slope, etc., sunlight, that we certainly see little pockets of diversity scattered throughout native remnants. So we thought that maybe this might be an opportunity to somewhat kind of replicate that, especially for pollinators. So thank you, folks. Thanks for looking at it.
I guess I would add a couple of things. One, it seemed like the spatial representation, or that it seemed like there was some sort of evenness with where those different patches were. So you might want to actually cluster some, like Megan was saying, not only for the invertebrates, but to move across them, but also I worry a little bit about what is the composition of the surrounding habitat. So if those areas are dominated by aggressive species, you may end up losing some of the diversity in those little pockets. So if all those little spots are surrounded by a matrix of really aggressive things that are cheaper, you may have a long-term kind of management issue there. So I would try to do some that are a little more clustered together, and then I'll be really cautious about what is the composition of the surrounding area.
And that's exactly what we've done. I mean, the whole mix itself is similar to like a CP42 seed mix. Mm-hmm. These areas that you see and less aggressive from a grass dominated perspective, we haven't seen any dispersal or movement into these forb tracts, these forb parcels from the great areas outside them yet in the last 4 years. And we haven't seen a lot of dispersal outside them yet either, and feathering out into the more grass dominated areas. So, but this mix overall was about the upland grasses, what we call the dominant grasses outside the pollinator nodes. It's about $650 an acre. Mm-hmm. The pollinator nodes themselves are about $900 an acre for the nodes. So, but thank you for your insight.
One more thought on that is that Dan Hernandez at Carleton College in Northfield is doing a sort of similar study, and he has a little longer term data set. I think they're going on 10 years now, and they are measuring how big bluestem and Indian grass are moving into the highly diverse areas. So I can't link any publications right now, but Dan Hernandez, he's the chair of the biology department at Carleton College. Has been doing research on that. So
thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Oh, good. We have some questions in the chat, and I'm going to try to answer them in order. Well, I'm going to start with your question. I know Karin and I were typing some stuff, but I want to give some context to my answer a little bit. So your question was, can you add species in later to reduce initial costs? And Karin gave you a great answer that said, yes, it can be complicated. Check out this wonderful guide from Xerces about interseeding. And then I gave you a typical ecologist response of yes and no. And the reason why I said that is because if you are talking about adding diversity back into a site that is essentially a wall of big bluestem, no, you can't do that without major disturbance. I was laughing when we toured Minnesota Native Landscapes production fields 2 years ago, because they showed us a site where they were growing butterfly milkweed, and integrating with the butterfly milkweed was all of this big bluestem. And I was like, hey, what's all that big bluestem doing in your production plot? And they were like, we have been tilling this plot, spraying it, doing deep plowing for 20 years, and we cannot get rid of this big bluestem. Which then said to me, if that's where we start on the land, like if you try to do this like economic mix or base economy mix and you end up with a wall of big bluestem, you're going to have real problems trying to build that diversity in. But we also have other sites that have started with an economy mix where things are a little bit more in balance, where we've had parks, for example, seeding those sites every single year. And then they end up with these beautifully diverse, rich areas. And so it just kind of depends on where you start. And there really is, there's a lot. I am very nervous about getting to that wall of grass, because I've seen it happen too many times when our base level of diversity isn't high enough, I guess is what I'll say, and the balance isn't right. And so there is a certain baseline that I would really encourage us to shoot for, and not rely on an idea of, well, I'll come back and I'll do it later, because what happens is generally later there's a bigger problem that now you need to address before you can even get diversity back in there. So that's my thoughts on that. Karin, did you have more you wanted to say about that one?
I think you covered it well, but just to check out the interseeding guide, because it gives you strategies for how to interseed in different contexts. So if you're starting with a cool season grass stand, there's like 4 or 5 different scenarios for how you would suppress that grass prior to seeding. Or if you're a mixed grass stand or purely warm season grass stand, there's lots of different strategies for how to suppress it. And so there's a lot of cool information in that guide. It's one of my favorite guides that we offer. So
my favorite guides.
So check it out.
So Molly asked a question about chemical drift. Molly, you're right on. I mean, we're dealing where we're at in Minnesota. We're in a highly agricultural landscape, and I'm not trying to paint agriculture as like a bad thing. We obviously need agriculture. Minnesota is a farming state that's not going to change anytime soon. But there's some ways that we do agriculture that could be changed to, quite frankly, be more beneficial to the prairie and be more beneficial to us. And I'm using the word be intentionally. So I think this idea that you talked about of, let's make sure that we're not creating a sink. Like maybe we sort of structure the diversity so it's in the middle and then we have kind of a buffer. It's not a bad idea. Part of my struggle is that what we're seeing is even in our large units, like our really big units that are 500 acres plus, we're still seeing drift in the middle of those units. So I'm not convinced at this point in time that there is a buffer that is wide enough that is going to protectively insulate the insects in the center of even some of our very big conservation units. And so part of what I'm kind of thinking, and there's also research that came out of our Division of Wildlife Research Unit down in Medelia, where they showed that even if you just had a blue stem buffer around the whole thing, that blue stem was still funneling the chemical into the site just by its sheer ability to capture that chemical, just like it captures a raindrop. And so it was still getting transported into the interior. And I hope I'm not characterizing that wrong. This is like a really oversimplification of what I heard during their research presentation. But so it's a tough question. I quite frankly don't know how to answer it, and I don't know how to answer it because we're seeing drift even in the center of these big units. So I don't know, Karin, if you have a...
You want us to plant a tree hedgerow is what I'm hearing.
No, that is not what I said. Molly's just giving me sass.
The solution, although it's not an easy one, is to reduce pesticides. I mean, not build around it, but to reduce the pesticides. I mean, that's one of the best things we can do for pollinator protection and diversity protection. There's a study that came out of Switzerland, I think last week, that showed, it was an agricultural study showing pesticide residues long-term on conventional sites and organic sites of different ages. And even 20-year-old organic farms had long-term pesticide residues from after 20 years of organic production. There's still these pesticides lingering in the soils, which is affecting soil biodiversity, which of course is affecting our reconstructions and our diversity in our plantings. So, I mean, anyway, yeah. Reducing pesticides, it's not an easy solution, but it has to be part of the solution.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, Karin. At some point, I understand what you're saying, Molly. Like, what can we do right now before we solve all the world's problems, right? Like, is there something we can do right now that would be beneficial and not create a sink? But I don't have a good answer for that one, and I apologize. I'm gonna move to Bill. He said, have you seen success planting hemiparasitic species in your mix in year 1, or should they be added in years 2 to 5? So this is a mixed bag from what I hear from managers. Some of those species seem to do okay from seed, but when I say they do okay from seed, they're definitely being seeded at a higher rate. Like, they're not just thrown in at a trace like 0.01 ounce per acre or something. They're in there at like 3 and 4 ounces. And I'm thinking of wood betony in particular. And so that one, for species like that, I really think of them as restoration conservative. I don't know what the barrier is to getting them established, but I would encourage folks to plant them as a bare root plant or a dormant plug. And so I think it's best to try to, for some of those species, I don't know, I go back and forth. In my early restoration career, I was like a crazy baker, right? I'd be like, oh, I'll have a dash of this and a dash of that and a pinch of that over here and just hope for the best that it grows. And now I still do some of that, but I also like to identify the plants that I really know are going to be conservative and try to think through a different way to add them. So I've actually been adding them in year 1 and asking our managers to add them in year 1 as a dormant plug or bare root. And the reason I keep saying dormant plug is that for DNR, we don't have the ability to go out and water our sites. We just don't do it. And so what we need to be doing is making sure that those, as we're planting them, that they're already dormant so that we don't have to be married to watering them throughout the season, because we just don't have the resources and the staff and the time to do that. So when you plant a dormant plug, just like anything that you're planting, you need to give them a big old drink of water. And I shoot for a minimum of 50 plants of each species that you're planting, because most of our plants need a minimum of 50 individuals to have a viable population. So that's my answer. Short. Karin, do you have other things?
I think that was pretty well covered. So,
okay.
And you have more experience with that than I do. I just think for those of you who it's not practical to add in live plants after the fact, and you have one shot at this, put it in year one.
Yeah.
Because that might be your only chance.
I agree. Could you talk some about how nutrient loading, this is a big one, especially nitrogen, leads to decreased conservative species dominance in reconstructions? If that's something that you've experienced, we, Missouri, welcome Missouri, often struggle with sites that have historically had nitrogen added, which tends to lead to ruderal species dominance in plantings. One potential solution that has been bantered around is topsoil removal also removes adventive seeds from the site. Yeah. Like, this is my, yeah. So the nitrogen and carbon cycle in many of the sites that we're restoring is completely broken. Most of the reconstructions that I'm doing, and Karin, definitely speak to the ones that you're doing, but we're mostly planting into farmed areas, or they were farmed and they were tilled. And because they were tilled, our carbon and nitrogen cycle is all kinds of messed up. And so one of the things that we have been trying to do, and the land managers together in partnership, is not treating our prairie plants like they're magic beans and trying to get the site conditions right first. So I'm really advocating for temporary covers and using, like, why would I put a cover crop into a field when I'm trying to grow soybeans? I put it in there because something's not right in my soil and I want to build in diversity. I want to do that same thing to build my soil structure and my soil health if I'm going to prairie seeds. And so I've been playing around more with that. I don't think the answer is to remove topsoil ever, because we've already lost so much of that soil through just general farming practices if we're farming in a conventional agricultural system. And so I don't want to remove topsoil because that I can't get that back, right? Like, it's going to take too long for me to build that organic matter and that structure in the top part of the soil back. So I'm trying to figure out ways that I can fix those cycles that are broken by using some of these other tools in the toolbox. Karin, I'm gonna punt it to you.
I would just put it in a similar way, just like use a temporary cover, and it may be temporary for 3 years, and select species that are known to be nitrogen scavengers, or things that you can kind of pull out some of those excess nutrients that you don't want. Pull all the plant material off the site, so you're actually harvesting the excess nutrients off the site. And then when you go back in, add as much diversity as you can. That's kind of an oversimplified answer, but yeah, I would also feel I feel cautious about recommending removing soil, although I'm sure there are stories that are successful in certain ways, but especially with certain weed seed banks. But yeah.
Yeah, I think what we learned from Sue Galadowicz did a whole study on reed canary grass and moving soil, and what they ultimately concluded, and somebody fact check me on this if I'm mischaracterizing it, was that you would have to remove so much soil to make it worth it that you're essentially breaking the system as you do that. And so you might be able to get rid of reed canary grass, but what are you left with at the end of the day? Like a bunch of subsoil. That's not really conducive to growing anything back. So then Matt had just a comment, lots of management answers to your problems with walls of big blue stem. That's how I imagine you're saying it, Matt. And you're right. And one thing this is all about seed mixes. We didn't even talk about how you can make heterogeneity with grazing, with fire. The problem is that depending on where you are with your prairie, you might not have all of those tools. Burning might be really difficult for lots of different reasons. You might just have an acre of prairie, and that acre is super important, just like 500 acres is. At this point, in my perspective, we've lost so much prairie that every piece we have matters. And every piece we're building matters because it's all going to contribute to that connected whole. That's just my personal whatever. So that's another thing. Let's say spend a lot of time fighting woody invasives, cottonwood and aspen in our prairie grasslands. Absolutely. Gives you less time to focus on biodiverse plant communities. Yeah, it's really a trade-off. I was chatting with Chris Hauser out in Nebraska the other day, and he was telling me they're planting 200 plus species each time they're doing a seed mix. And my immediate response was, what? How? And he basically said that they have shifted everything they were doing. They were spraying invasives before. They were putting a lot of energy, just as you described, into that. And he said, we're not doing that anymore. We have realized that if we get our diversity right, it solves most of these problems for us. So we have completely restructured our program to where all we do is go hand collect seed. I mean, that I'm oversimplifying this. This isn't all they do, but they hand collect a bunch of seed instead of being on a sprayer and spraying stuff to try to build things in that are going to basically move the system along for them. And then they have grazing and fire, obviously, in the mix too, but it's just a different way of thinking about reconstruction, because there's always going to be that trade-off. If I do this, then I don't have time to do this. And we're seeing a lot of our managers, Kent and Bill, I have to give them major street cred and props here in the DNR, because they have shifted a lot of what they're doing to this hand collection, because they are seeing in real time those benefits to their prairies, where they're having less weed issues because they're getting that diversity right. So it's about kind of, I don't know, rethinking why we're doing things and how we could do them to be more successful. Okay, Karin, I'm gonna let you take this next one. Don't forget about neonics. Do you want to talk about that?
Just that it's a good point. I mean, yeah, those are in the soil. They persist in the soil. They're not regulated as pesticides. Seed treatments aren't. And so they are just ubiquitous and in our environment, and they're systemic insecticides. So for those of you who aren't familiar with neonics, they're systemic insecticides that are that come on like corn and soybean seeds. Not all soybean, but pretty much all corn seeds are treated or conventional anyway. And then it disperses in the environment through dust from planting, or in water. It's water soluble, so it moves through the environment in aquatic paths. And then because it's systemic, other plants outside of the crop field take up this insecticide and express it in their vascular tissue, in their nectar, their pollen, and it can have toxic effects and sublethal effects. Xerces has a ton of information on this. There was recently a really big sort of scandal that happened in Nebraska with an ethanol plant, just sort of Xerces news, but also global news. An ethanol plant that was using leftover treated seed, and they just had this huge waste problem where people in the community are getting sick. It's like over 5,000 times what is supposed to be what is allowed to be in the local water system. So anyway, if we can start moving away from neonics, we would be a lot better for it. But again, our general stance is to reduce pesticides, and I know it's tricky. I will say that.
I'm with you. That was good. Some good discussion about hemiparasites, and then a question about seeding native grasses in dry, steep soils such as sandy loam, loamy sand. Any comments on seeding rate, broadcasted and drilled? So most of what Minnesota DNR does, or I should say most of what Southern Minnesota DNR does, because that's where my region is, and we do things differently across the state of Minnesota. We really we do a lot of broadcast seeding, and we do a lot of broadcast seeding in the dormant season. The reason for that is because we like our prairies not to be in rows. That makes them look a little bit more natural when they're not drilled. Also, with a drill, even with a Truax, when you have when you're really doing diverse mixes, some of those forb seeds are dust. And so trying to get them seeded where they don't go too deep is a real issue. And so we like broadcasting because that is just a way that solves that. We also like that dormant season because the nature's doing the work of stratification for you. We have also taken, I shouldn't say how we do this, but we've taken some of those sandy slope grasses like porcupine grass, needle and thread grass, the types of things that basically when you get them from a seed vendor are like a giant clump of hay that's all intertwined. We soak it in water, and then by hand, you kind of do this motion where you're breaking the seed apart and throw it out there to colonize those hill slopes. It's labor intensive. You're going to have eaten so many cubic yards of soil by the end of your day doing that from driving around on those dusty slopes on a four-wheeler, dispersing those seeds. I think you'll have little goggle marks, but my gosh, it looks cool when you're done. And you get these excellent, just structural heterogeneity. Like everything we're telling you today is probably ruining your life and making it harder. But it should be hard. You are shaping the land for the next 100+ years. We should be taking the time to make these investments and do that work. And it's difficult, but if we prioritize it, we're working with nature instead of against nature. There's also a nice study out of Iowa that showed that after about 10 years, when they evaluated their reconstructions, there was no difference in planting based on type of drilling, broadcast, planting method. There wasn't a difference, a statistical difference in sites. So it just might be what works best for you in that case. Okay, I'm looking to the next one. Conservation tillage cover crops can help suck out. Yeah, that's a great point about cover crops sucking out excess nitrogen. Sawdust. Yep. Good point, Jamie. Topsoil removal. Yeah, I'm real nervous about a lot of this topsoil removal stuff. There's other people who are doing it and then trying to add soil back in. I think that sounds like a great recipe to move a lot of weed seeds around, is what I think it sounds like. And it makes me real nervous. And for soil, a complex entity, if you will, that has a huge biological component that has thousands of species in it, to be just removing that and moving it around, I got real concerns about that. I'd rather keep the soil on site and figure out how we can make it better. So that's kind of Karin, you had a great comment in one of your slides that I don't think you said about how many organisms are in a square meter of soil. It was something like 500, I don't know.
I don't think I had that in there.
I was reading your notes. Maybe I didn't get it.
But it's true. I mean, I think it's not just, there's so much more beyond just nutrients in our soil, and we know they're depleted and degraded, but there's a lot going on in there that we haven't identified yet. And I mean, Xerces right now is just on the cusp of publishing kind of a soil life guide. We're doing a lot of talks on this. There's so many critical animals and bacteria and fungi in the soil that you can't just order those up and get them back in. I mean, even though they're degraded, I think we got to start with what naturally occurred there. I don't know. That's my feeling. Sort of a gut
somebody
thing.
has their hand up, and this is a Teams thing that I just don't know how to figure out. I can't see because there's so many people on the call. I can't figure out who has their hand up. So if you have your hand up and you want to ask a question, please just ask it now. Bill Johnson has his hand up. I want to make sure. And Bill, if you already asked your question in the chat, maybe we already answered it and we're just that good.
I haven't been keeping track of the chat as well as you have, Megan, but for those of you who have added things that that we haven't touched on, this is also a time to speak up if you want our input.
Hey, you all, this is Amanda. So early on, someone asked about when you were talking about herbicide, carryover, and somebody asked about that, and because they often do an ag lease for a year or two prior to planting, and Mike Malling added a reference with some herbicides on it to be wary of. So I'm just kind of pointing that out if anybody missed that while you were presenting.
Perfect. I'm also going to add a herbicide rotation restriction document into the chat that folks can grab. And that kind of, a key point with this is that this is for forage crops. And that's not to say that prairie can't be forage, but it's for more like, I don't know what I'm trying to say, like not native stuff that we plant as forage. And so just keep in mind that that's what the document's for, but I think if there's a problem, if it's affecting sunflowers in a forage system like an agronomic sunflower, you can make some gentle leaps in your mind that there are going to be similar issues for a native sunflower. So I don't think they're big leaps for us to make with that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think when you're reading labels and you're trying to figure out persistence, the best tool that we have right now is just to look at either clovers or sunflowers, if they even list those.
There, I just dropped that into the chat there if you want to grab that document. I'm sorry, I should have done that earlier, but apparently I can't do 3 things at once. So, so there's that. Yeah, the herbicide rotation restriction is a big one. We're coming off of a time where folks say to me all the time, well, I want to plant into soybeans because it's clean. This whole idea that I want a clean site is wrong. I'm just going to say it. It's wrong. Nature is filled with organisms and you are never going to eradicate them all. And what you don't want a clean site, you want a site that is healthy and ready to support the prairie seeds that you're going to put into it. So you want a site where your biological activity is jump-started, your soil structure is starting to be fixed, your carbon nitrogen cycle is on its way to a better, healthier, more normal system. This idea of like, I want to nuke it all and make it clean and flat and fluffy so then I can put my prairie in there. That's just bad ecology. I'm just going to say it. It's not, you want that site to be filled with activity, with biological activity and with structural change. And so we're going to have to start thinking about how we start correcting that before we plant our prairie into it. And I know this is like, what? But that's just where I'm at. Yes, please, Mike, please drop some PDFs in there. You just drag them and drop them over the little box that says type a new message, and then they take a little bit to load, and then you hit the arrow and send them once they're loaded. I think we hit all the questions. Well, Matt had a comment about so I'm going to make my cow joke just for everybody who's still here. We have this idea, and we've had it for a while, that there's conservation and then there's grazing, and that they are separate from each other. What I'm going to tell you is that the same mix that you would make for a cow is the same mix that you would make for a bee if you are doing it with diversity as the backbone. So whether I'm putting it in a bee, I'm putting it in a buffalo, I'm putting it in a cow, I should still have those same tenets of diversity because both of them need a diverse diet in order to be resilient and the healthiest bee, buffalo, cow that they can be. So this idea that buffalo were not walking around the prairie going, hey guys, where's all the clover and timothy? I don't see it. Do you? No, they were eating native plants. They were eating grass. That's what they're doing, and that's what they continue to do. And so when we put cows back in as that top grazer in the system, we need to be thinking about them as a married entity, that grazer is going to need those same components of diversity. And we shouldn't just be thinking about that as clover or timothy or these traditional kind of pasture non-native forage mixes. I mean, what are all the cows doing in Nebraska? They're eating prairie. that's what they're doing out there. So there's definitely ways to make that work.
But if you are concerned about losing certain species over time because they're like so-called ice cream plants, then I think stocking rate is the key thing to change.
Oh,
not necessarily the composition of the seed mix or the planting, but it's all about stocking.
It's not just about grazing, it's how you do it. So what does Kent Solberg with Sustainable Farming Association say? It's the how, not the cow. How did you do it? What's your rate? What's your intensity? What's your timing? What's your frequency? How much rest do you have in the system? Oh gosh, there's all kinds of things. Could you speak more to prescribed fire timing and how it might affect insect populations, especially late growing season fire? All I'm going to say, and then I'm just going to turn it right over to Karin, is if you do the same thing over and over again, you are impacting the same things in your prairie and benefiting the same other things. So if you always burn in the spring, you are benefiting the same group of plants, the same group of insects, the same group of wildlife, and you are harming the same group of on the reverse side of that. So fire and grazing and all the things that disturb a prairie are the things that keep a prairie persisting, but they're also things that can destroy the very things that we want that prairie to support, like insects.
Hey, Megan.
Yeah.
Can I make a brief comment here? I was at a Habitat Partners conference several years ago in Iowa, and we had a gentleman, I believe it was from Xerces, or I think it was from a different pollinator. It was a different pollinator conservation group, and he asked a good friend of mine named Scott Motes with the Nature Conservancy. He manages the largest intact tract of prairie in the state of Iowa, and it's all very steep, silty, lussy, dry prairie, and they graze with bison, and they burn regularly. And he asked about burning for pollinators, and I like his answer. I know it probably ruffles tail feathers a little bit, but he said it's an important consideration, but we really have to think more along the lines of when we can burn, when we can get the acres done that we want to get done, and try to leave unburned refugia for insects, because there are species that one burn if timed improperly will cause some problems. But he said we can't worry as much about some of those things because fire is a very dangerous tool to use on the land, and so planning that burn is very, very important. But it's sometimes impossible to burn specifically for every single species on your site. That's why we try to leave unburned areas, like with CRP, they require burning in thirds or in halves. That's why at like Broken Kettle Preserve where Scott works, they don't burn the whole thing every year. They try not to. And so, when you are burning, if you're worried about pollinators, my recommendation is burn late into fall or early in spring, but it is gonna impact the vegetation that you see. So.
Yeah, the one caveat I would add to that is that just like we're saying diversity is important in your seed mix, it's important in your management. And I mean both like type of management, timing, duration, return interval, all of that. And I think where we get ourselves into trouble is we're people, we like our calendar, we like it organized, we figured out how to do things in a certain window and how to do them safely. And so Karen's got it. Hey, the UPS is at Karen's house.
Yep.
That's great. She's getting back. But yeah, diversity both in your seed mix and in your management, because I see too many times where we burn over and over and over again in the spring, and then we're like, my prairie just keeps the same things keep happening out there. Well, yeah, like you got to figure out how you're going to do that like you said, safely, but also make sure you're mixing it up.
Yes.
And landscape context really matters too when you're thinking about what's possible for recolonization, where the tract is that you're managing, and dispersal from other sites around the area. I know a lot of people see good results burning frequently for the vegetation, and then they're just relying on surrounding areas to repopulate that unit, but that just doesn't happen. Unfortunately, there's like kind of a paradox with burning and pollinators, and that burning really helps some of the most important nectar plants for like regal fritillary, for example. But if they are, they also can't be burned up in the process. And so you need that patchiness. So pollinators need it, but you can never burn without having some I don't know, collateral damage from somebody. So just patchiness and heterogeneity is the key.
Absolutely. And there's some tech issues in the side for opening up some of these files that we're dropping in. I don't know why they're not allowing you to grab them and download them. And so for mine, it shows that they're in there and it's okay, but I don't know why it's not letting you guys access them. So
Megan, the error said that I didn't have access to the Minnesota 365 site. Right, so it's like on your OneDrive or whatever.
Oh, man. Yeah, that's a Teams thing. I can't give you access to that either because that's a Teams blocks it to my organization. So if you need that herbicide rotation restriction, just shoot me an email and I'll send it right back to you. Because apparently there's not an easy way that I can pop it in here, and you can get it. So if you need that, just send me an email and I'll send it to you. We have a couple more questions and then we'll probably close out because we're 40. This is great. Like you guys, a lot of you have hung on. I mean, I know we lost about half of our folks intermittently throughout, but there's still a bunch of you hanging on, just wanting to chat restoration and prairie on a cold February day. So we definitely appreciate your enthusiasm and your interest. Lots of good comments in the side about working with grazers or graziers. I don't even know how to say that word. People who have livestock, where they're saying that their animals get heavier when they're on native. I mean, here's the key. Like, just like if all you ate every single day was Taco John's. Okay, I shouldn't talk about Taco John's. If all you ate every single day was fast food, that your body and your health is going to be different than somebody like Karin who has 600 kinds of plants and animals that she's putting into her body on a regular basis. The more we need diversity too. Don't forget, diversity is the #1 indicator of health in any system. Any system. I don't just mean ecological system. So if your body is a system, the more diverse things you eat, that is going to contribute to your health and just your overall wellness. And the same is true if you're a cow. That's why I say it doesn't matter if you're a bee or a cow. The same tenets of diversity need to be followed with what you are putting into them. So you want to make sure that you've got all of these other kinds of flowers. Yes, a lot of our cows, they want that grass component, but they'll also eat wildflowers too, because they have nutritional wisdom about what they need at that certain time, and they need a certain micronutrient or something else that they can't just get from 1 or 2 or 7 plants. The more options we give them, the better off they're going to be. I could go off on a whole tangent on this, but I'm not gonna.
It's tough to compete because there's so much, just years and years, hundreds of years of research on forage, for cattle, for weight gain, for making them gain weight fast. And so we don't have that kind of data. There is some information from range management, that kind of thing, about which native species are really going to add a lot of caloric value or whatever. I mean, what Megan's saying about diversity creating overall health for the cow is absolutely true. But I don't know of a lot of resources, although I would be happy to dig into this if anybody wanted me to. I know there are range management resources. Yeah.
Everybody needs to read this book.
You have it right on.
It's called Nourishment by Fred Provenza. It's like a Aldo Leopold type book, the way he writes. It's just kind of transcendent. It's not like you're even reading a research book. It feels nice to read it. It just talks a lot about how we have separated the conservation world from the agronomic world when it comes to grazing, and the two can really be intertwined. And I'm not saying, so Sean, to answer your question, yes, you still want to design a diverse native prairie mix. That's the goal, whether you're doing it so that it can provide forage for cows, cow-calf pairs, whatever it is, or you're doing it for pollinators. You can make the same mix that would benefit both, is what I'm saying. And we often have thought about these things as two distinct separate entities. And so we need to start remembering that grazing is absolutely a part of the prairie and it's part of the disturbance. And I'm not saying that that means we should graze every single acre of prairie everywhere in exactly the same way, because we all know we also have less than 2% left when we're talking about tallgrass prairie systems. So it's not the same ball game, but grazers have a role to play in that ball game, and we just have to now figure out how they're going to get in the game. Okay, let me see here. Make sure we didn't miss some of these last ones. Yeah, Sean, I totally get it. It's just it's like everything, like Karen's answer earlier that she said, we have a lot of change making to do. And part of our jobs as conservationists are to help people understand these ecological principles and how to apply them. And particularly when we're dealing with our farming partners, talking about how you can be profitable and do these things. Soil health isn't just a great thing because it's great for water quality and for soil health as a whole. It's great because you can make a ton of money doing it because you have less inputs. It's just farming smarter, not harder. And so we need to try to make those arguments and also recognize the limitations to making change quickly. Like sometimes it is difficult. There are equipment hurdles that, oh my gosh, how much does a planter cost? $100,000, $200,000, like a no-till planter. These are not things that are necessarily just going to be a snap for somebody to make operational. Diversity in species, time and treatment size treatment is going to be better over the long run. Yes, Stacy, I completely agree. What was the name and author of the book again? It's called Nourishment. I'm going to type it in the chat. By Fred Provenza. You can get your copy today online. Let's see here. Oh, thanks, Jamie. You already put it in there. You're so good. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. It's really merging the two worlds together as they always should have been. And I think as you move west across the prairie landscape, some of the concepts we struggle with because our prairie really is much more fragmented. We have a lot of smaller pieces. We don't have these big expanses of grassland like Nebraska has that are all connected. We're also, Minnesota is not a big grazing state. It's just not. And so trying to figure out how we operationalize this when we have those connectivity challenges and we don't necessarily have the livestock, those are tough things that we're going to have to figure out. So, if you have an audience that you probably nice, Mike. Yeah, I think so we're right at 50 minutes over our webinar time for questions. So I think we'll go ahead and close out for good. If you have questions for me and Karin, please just email them to us. This is exactly what the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative is about. Everything that's happening in the chat is the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative in real time. It's sharing what we know, talking about ideas, putting our heads together and trying to figure this stuff out. So I'm just super appreciative of Karin's partnership because she always helps expand my mind. I'm super appreciative that we get to, her calming influence on the webinar really balances out my craziness. So thanks Karin for doing this with me today. Thanks everybody for listening. And please sign up to be part of the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative.
Thank you, everybody. Really great to have you and your engagement.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, wow, almost an hour over.
Yeah, I know. Go have a snack. You guys all earned it. Okay, I have to stop a recording. That's what I have to do. Karin, do you want to hang out just for a second, and maybe Amanda and Jamie, our Prairie Reconstruction folks?